Now, I want to give you a very crash course, a very crash course. Yes, that's correct. Very crash course of using PEST as testing framework into your Laravel APIs. We're going to cover very basics, how to create new PEST file, how to send the request, how to write a simple test of your API endpoint. And I think this is going to be a great starting point, which you can extend and improve step by step. So what I'm going to do right now is create new test file. But before I do this, we're going to explore this existing tests folder, inside which we have an example test, which is something not really helpful, which we can delete. And we can have a look inside features/auth, which comes, basically these files comes with these files come with Laravel Breeze. Laravel Breeze gives the authentication test, email verification, and all these things. But the thing is that Laravel Breeze, as I mentioned a couple of times, is trusting that we're building the API for a browser. So the tests are kind of browser for browsers as well. So if we have a look, right here, we're sending a typical post request on the following URL. Then the user must be authenticated, and then assert no content basically means that the response should not contain any content. So this is the test for the code we had previously in the authenticated session controller, which is right now called a logging controller, right? We called this a logging controller. Previously, it was authenticated session controller, and it was doing the exact same thing. The test is testing. So authenticating, session regeneration, and returning with no content. But we're going to do this slightly differently, okay? So we can reuse the same file, authentication test, or we can do this slightly differently, okay? I'm going to leave this authentication test, and maybe we can delete this later, but I want to show you how you can generate also new test file. For this, we're going to execute PHP artisan make test, and I'm going to call this login API test. We're going to hit the enter. Login API test was created. We're going to open this. And that test file was created under tests feature login API test, because this is related into authentication. If we want to generate this inside auth, we're going to delete this and we're going to re-execute the same command, but we're going to provide auth/login API test. Now that was generated inside auth folder. Now let's open this, and we have this very basic and simple test, which simply checks that the / returns with status code. We're going to delete this. We don't need this part. So we're going to start testing with the API. And the first test, what we are going to write is to check if the authentication for the user works with the correct email and password. User can log in with valid credentials via API. So we are testing this through API when the response type is JSON, not something redirect. So this is our first test. Now we're going to create a user right now, and then we're going to authenticate it with that user. To create the user, I'm using user factory, and I'm calling create. So we haven't talked about factories at all. If you want to know more about factories in general, or every single detail about the factories, you can check my Laravel for Beginners course, first 11 hours on YouTube, 24 total, the full course, 24 hours on my website. But right now, if we have user factory, I want to open this. User factory actually comes with Laravel, and it has several definitions right here. The factory class in general is helpful when we want to generate a bunch of data for the model. And user factory defines how each property should be generated. So in this case, it generates fake name, fake email verified at is going to be now. It hashes the password plain text into a hash, and it has this remember token to be some random string. However, when calling user factory create, we can also provide additional fields, override those fields. For example, we can provide email to be always something what we want, such as test@example.com, and then we can provide the password to be bcrypt of password 123. All right, so now the user is created, and now we're going to send the request. We know that the user exists in the database. Okay, let's send the request. We're going to use this, and we're going to use the method post.json. And we're sending the request on /API/v1/login. Or login is, I think, without v1, right? So we're passing this associative array, email, and password here. The password, of course, needs to be plain password. So we're sending post request on the following URL, and we got the response. Now, on that response, we have a couple of helpful methods which we can call and check if the user successfully authenticated or not. For example, on response, we can call method assert status. Assert status checks if the response has the following status code, 200 as an example. So we expect that the response should have status code 200. We can actually, let me execute this. I don't want other tests to be executed. So what I want to do is probably delete this authentication test. Yeah, I want to delete this authentication test. We should probably also delete registration test because that works also slightly differently. We have not touched email verification and password reset, so maybe we can leave them. But let me test PHP artisan test. Okay, some was passed, some was failed. That was our API login test, login API test was passed. Look at this, and the password reset was failed. That's fine. We can live with that, which we're going to fix later, but we're focusing on this login API test, which successfully completed. So the authentication works and the response returned with the status code 200. But optionally, we can add different assert methods, and you can find all the methods right here. So right now, I want to check that the returned JSON structure, assert JSON structure, looks like this. So we expect user to be presented there, which should be an object, and there should be ID, there should be name, and there should be email of the returned user. Okay, but also the response should contain token. Additionally, I want to check assert JSON that returned user has the following JSON inside. It should have user, and each user should, like not each, but the user should have ID, which is going to be just created user's ID. It should have name, which is going to be just created user's name, and it should have email, which is going to be just created user's email. Okay, so far so good. Now we're testing all these three things, that the status code is 200, we have the following structure, and the following JSON is returned. We can also check that the token is not empty, but we can do this using a different way. Like we're going to use expect method, expect response JSON or token. We're taking out token from the JSON, and then we use not to be empty. Cool. And finally, I want to check that the user needs to be authenticated. This assert authenticated, that the user is authenticated after all this. So Again, let's send the request. Actually, if we execute --help right here, we're going to find some parameters using which we can only execute a specific test. So where's that? Okay, let me just try to execute PHP artisan test auth / login API test. Auth login API test not found. Maybe we're going to use this \. I know there's a way, just I don't remember by heart. Yeah, I don't remember all the things by heart. Okay, that doesn't work. This is the way how we're going to execute a single test. PHP artisan test -- filter equals and our class name. When we execute this, we're going to see that the test has been successfully completed, meaning our test actually works, and that's great. So if we create like user with email test2@example.com, then we don't expect that test to pass because this actually should fail. So we're sending a request with a test. Actually, let's create test@example.com and then check if there is test2 in the database. That should fail. That was failed. These credentials do not match our records. Now I'm going to add second test, which tests that invalid email authentication with invalid email doesn't work in our application. So I'm going to minimize this part and I'm going to paste this test and explain this. So we are creating, actually, we're going to return this into test2 first. So this should be a valid text that the user can authenticate. Now here, that the user cannot log in with invalid email via API. So we create the user with the following email, then we try to authenticate with the wrong email, and we expect status code 422, plus there should be a validation error on email property, and we're checking that the user is guessed, not authenticated. Okay, that's pretty cool. Another test which I want to put in our project. So, user cannot log in with invalid password via API. So we create the user again, then we send the request into login API endpoint with a wrong password. In this case, email is correct, but the password is wrong. All right. Then we expect 422 status code. Again, we expect the validation error to be on email because no matter whether email is wrong or password is wrong, we're still checking we are still adding the error message on the email. Okay, let's see this. Login controller. Scroll at the top. Login request. Open this. And we see here authenticate. And this attempt, if this attempt is failed, we return with a validation exception with a message on email property. So this is the key thing. Okay, now we added this third test to check that the authentication doesn't work. Now I'm going to copy another test here. Our login requires email field. If we don't provide email field at all during login, we expect that there should be a test. I'm going to copy another one, which should be that the password is required. So we are testing that the password is required as well. Another test to test that the email must be a valid email address. So this is wrong. If we try to authenticate with the following email and password, we expect 422 status code. And we also are going to check that throttling works. So this is what we are doing. Login is rate limited after too many attempts. So we create the user, then we try 5 times to authenticate with a wrong password. Okay. Then on the 6th successful attempt, we expect status code 422 with validation error on email as well. But there's one key thing what we are going to do. And this is about clearing out the throttling. So before each, we need the following function. Before each test, the following code should be executed. So because we are using test@example.com in every test for the user, so we're going to clear, and we're going to execute the tests from a local domain. So we're clearing out the rate limiter before every test. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this, and we're going to focus on this one. And before the following test is run, the rate limit will be cleared out, and we're sending 5 requests solely in this test. And if it fails, then 6.1 will not allow us to authenticate as well. And the last test, not the last one, but actually I have a couple of tests in this file, but that's going to be the only test file we're going to focus. So we're going to check that the login works after late limit expires. That is also a very important thing. So we create the user, we make 5 failed attempts, and this triggers rate limiting. Then we clear the rate limit, and then we try to log in with the correct email and password, and we expect status code 200 with the following JSON structure, and we expect the user to be authenticated. Okay, another test. Login endpoint requires guest middleware. So we create the user and we try to authenticate as already authenticated user. Okay, so look at this, acting as the following user. So we're trying to log in with this user, with the Sanctum authentication middleware. Okay, and in this case we expect 302 status code depending on the middleware configuration. So we will be redirected, we should be redirected somewhere when we try the following thing. And final test, this is going to check that the login response contains correct user data structure. So we provide John Doe, we provide the email and provide the password, we create this. Then we send the login request, we expect 200 status code, we expect the user information to be there, the ID, John Doe, email here, and we take the entire response data and we check that the user does not have key password and doesn't have key remember token. So those are secret information, and we're simply testing that we don't expose this information and we don't return in the API. Now we're going to bring up terminal and I'm going to execute PHP artisan test -- filter equals login API test. And look at this, 10 tests, all of them passed from our login API test. Well, in our application, we don't have taking care of this email verification part or password reset part at all. So I'm going to remove them completely from tests as well. From the unit, we also have one example test, which simply checks true equals true. That's fine. But I removed any test except this login API test, and I give you a challenge to add register API tests in the following way like we did for login. And now if I execute PHP artisan test without any kind of filter, it runs this example test and everything else, and all of them are